While my stepdaughter sat in her bridal suite dreaming of a $42,000 fairy tale wedding that I paid for, she sent me a text message at 2 a.m. informing that I was not her real father, and was officially uninvited, so her biological mother would be the one to take the place of honor and walk her down the aisle. She thought she could discard a decade of my love and still keep my checkbook, but she didn't realize that the second she revoked my seat at the table, I revoked the entire event. I didn't scream or beg. I simply called the venue and ordered a total blackout, ensuring that the only thing waiting for her at the altar was a locked door and the crushing realization that her real mother didn't have a single dime to her name. This is a true story of how I turned a bride's betrayal into her own social bankruptcy. My name is Anthony. I am a senior project manager for a global infrastructure firm, and I have spent my career managing multi-million-dollar contracts where every signature matters and every clause is binding. I spent 10 years building a life for Michaela after her biological mother abandoned us, but when she decided to lie to her fiancé about who was actually funding her lifestyle, she forgot that I am the sole signatory on every vendor contract for this wedding. I don't just build bridges. I know exactly how to burn them when the structural integrity of a relationship has been compromised beyond repair. If you have ever been the silent provider for people who only value you for what you can give them, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe right now to see the footage of the groom's face when he realized his bride-to-be was a fraud and walked away before the first vow was ever spoken. They thought they were staging a coronation for a mother who didn't show up, but they were actually witnessing the final foreclosure of a family bond, and the locks being changed in less than 24 hours. Michaela was 12 when I met her mother, Sarah. Sarah was a whirlwind of a woman who seemed to be running from a past she couldn't outpace, and Michaela was the quiet, wide-eyed ghost following in her wake. I stepped in when their world was crumbling, providing the steady foundation they lacked. I paid for the braces, the private tutors, the summer camps, and eventually, the Ivy League tuition. I was the one who sat in the front row of every graduation, holding the camera while her biological father, a man named Julian, was busy being a ghost in a bottle of cheap bourbon. I wasn't just a step in her life. I was the entire staircase. When Michaela got engaged to Marcus, a high-flying lawyer from a family that smelled of old money and even older secrets, she came to me with tears in her eyes. She told me she wanted a union of legacies, a wedding that would cement her place in Marcus's social circle. She presented me with a budget that would have funded a small municipal bridge, $42,000. It was an obscene amount of money for a single day, but I looked at her face and saw the little girl who used to ask me to check under her bed for monsters. I didn't hesitate. I pulled out my pen and signed the first of many contracts, becoming the sole financier and legal guarantor for the event of the season. For 8 months, I was the silent engine behind the curtain. I dealt with the florists who insisted on importing peonies from Holland, and the caterers who charged $50 a head just for the appetizers. Michaela was radiant, or so I thought, as she navigated the tastings and the dress fittings. But there was a shadow growing in the corners of her eyes that I didn't quite understand. She started talking less about our family and more about pedigree. She began dropping hints that Marcus's parents were very traditional, and that they valued biological lineage above all else. I brushed it off as pre-wedding nerves, never imagining that she was already planning my eviction from the very house I was building for her. The night of the betrayal began like any other Friday. I had just finished a grueling week overseeing a site in the city and was looking forward to a glass of scotch and a quiet evening. At 2 a.m., the blue light of my phone pierced the darkness of my bedroom. I reached for it, thinking there might be an emergency at the construction site. Instead, I saw a text from Michaela. It was a wall of text, cold and clinical, like a termination notice. She told me that after much soul-searching, she had reconnected with her biological mother, Linda. She said that Linda was family by blood, and that Marcus's parents felt it was only right that her real parents be the ones to present her to society. The words felt like a physical blow to my chest. She wrote that I was not her real father, and that my presence at the head table would be confusing and aesthetically inconsistent with the story they were telling Marcus's family. She thanked me for the financial assistance, but informed me that my seat had been given to Linda. I was officially uninvited from the $42,000 wedding I was currently paying for. She ended the message by asking me not to make a scene, as this was her special day, and she didn't want any unnecessary drama to ruin the atmosphere. She thought she could discard a decade of my love and still keep my checkbook wide open. I sat in the dark for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me. A younger man might have smashed the phone or driven to her house to scream. But I am 70 years old, and I have learned that the loudest noises are rarely the most effective. I felt a coldness settle into my bones, a professional detachment that I usually reserved for failing contractors. Michaela had made a catastrophic error in her calculations. She had treated me like a bank, forgetting that a bank has the power to foreclose. She didn't realize that the second she revoked my seat at the table, she had fundamentally breached the contract of our relationship. I didn't reply to her text. There was no point in arguing with a person who views loyalty as a disposable commodity. Instead, I got out of bed and went to my home office. I opened my laptop and pulled up the wedding folder. It was a masterpiece of organization. Every vendor, every contract, every payment schedule was logged in a spreadsheet. As a senior project manager, I never leave my name off the paperwork. I am the sole signatory on every single one of those documents. The venue, the flowers, the orchestra, the 5-tier cake, they didn't belong to Michaela. They belonged to me. I spent the next 3 hours making a list of every phone number I needed to call. I looked at the countdown clock on the wedding website she had created. It told me we were exactly 48 hours away from the ceremony. The timing was perfect. By the time the sun began to peek over the horizon, I had a plan that would do more than just cancel a party. I was going to ensure that the pedigree she was so worried about was revealed for exactly what it was, a house of cards built on a foundation of lies. She wanted a fairy tale, but she had forgotten that in the original stories, the villains are often the ones who were treated with the most cruelty. My first call was to the venue, a historic manor that charged a premium for its exclusivity. I spoke to the manager, a woman named Elena who I had dealt with several times over the months. I told her, in my most professional project manager voice, that there had been a change in the project scope. I informed her that as the sole payer and contract holder, I was exercising my right to a total cancellation effective immediately. She was hesitant, mentioning the loss of the deposit, but I told her to keep it. I told her I wanted the doors locked, the lights off, and the staff sent home. I wanted a total blackout. "But Mr. Anthony," she stammered, "the bride, she'll be arriving in 2 days. What do I tell her?" I leaned back in my chair, watching the sunrise paint the sky a bruised purple. I told her to tell Michaela exactly what she told me, that she should talk to her real parents about the bill. I hung up before she could respond. One pillar was down, and the roof was already starting to sag. But I was just getting started. There were 12 more vendors on my list, and by the time I was finished, Michaela would find that her special day was going to be the most expensive lesson in structural integrity she would ever receive. The sun was fully up now, a bright, mocking yellow that did nothing to warm the cold iron in my gut. I sat at my mahogany desk, the same desk where I had once helped Michaela with her calculus homework, and began the second phase of the decommissioning. In my line of work, we call this as-built versus as-designed. The design of this wedding was a fairy tale. The as-built reality was a fraud funded by a man they had decided was no longer necessary. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Petals and Prose, the florist shop that had convinced Michaela that her wedding needed more flowers than a botanical garden. The owner, a man named Julian who prided himself on his artistic temperament, answered on the third ring. I didn't give him time for a pleasantry. I told him that as the guarantor of the account, I was terminating the contract effective immediately and that no floral arrangements were to be delivered to the venue. He began to sputter about the rare Dutch peonies that were already in the refrigeration unit, but I cut him off with the precision of a guillotine. I reminded him that my contract included a force majeure clause that I had personally insisted on, a clause that allowed for cancellation in the event of a fundamental breach of trust, which I defined as my own lack of involvement. I told him he could sell the peonies to a funeral home for all I cared, but my credit card was now a closed door. Next came the orchestra. They were a group of 20 professional musicians who were supposed to play The Arrival of the Queen of Sheba, as Michaela walked down the aisle on the arm of her real mother. I called their manager and told him the music had stopped. He was more professional than the florist. He understood that when the man with the checkbook says the show is over, the instruments go back in their cases. I felt a grim satisfaction imagining the silence that would greet Michaela at the altar. Silence is a powerful tool in my trade. It's what happens right before a bridge collapses because someone forgot to account for the wind. By noon, I had neutralized the caterer, the photographer, and the high-end transportation service that was supposed to shuttle the blue blood guests in vintage Rolls-Royces. Each call was a brick removed from the foundation of Michaela's social ascent. I was dismantling her future with the same methodical care I used to build a highway bypass. I knew that Marcus's parents, the Whitbys, were the kind of people who valued appearances above all else. They weren't just welcoming a daughter-in-law, they were conducting a merger. If the merger didn't include the prestige and the polish that my money provided, they would look at Michaela and see nothing but a girl from a broken home with a ghost for a mother. I thought about Linda, the woman who was currently preparing to take my place. I knew Linda better than Michaela did, because I was the one who had spent the last decade tracking her down whenever she needed bail money or a stint in rehab, just to keep her away from Michaela's milestones. Linda was a predator who smelled opportunity like a shark smells blood in the water. She didn't want to walk Michaela down the aisle because of motherly love. She wanted to be seen in a $4,000 dress next to the Whitby family. She thought she was finally winning the lottery, but she didn't realize that the ticket had already been voided. Around 2 p.m., my phone began to vibrate incessantly on the desk. It was Michaela. Then it was Sarah, her mother. Then it was Marcus. I watched the screen light up with their names, a rhythmic pulse of desperation that I ignored with practiced ease. I wasn't ready to talk yet. In project management, you don't engage with the stakeholders until the site is secure and the hazards have been mitigated. If I answered now, I would be subjected to tears and excuses, to, "I didn't mean it that way," and, "Please think of my happiness." But they hadn't thought of my happiness or my dignity when they sent that 2 a.m. text. They had viewed me as a utility, like water or electricity, something that is always there until you decide you don't want to pay the bill. I decided to take a walk through my garden. I have a small grove of Japanese maples that I planted when I first bought this house, 30 years ago. They are slow-growing trees, requiring patience and the right kind of soil. I had treated Michaela like one of those trees, pouring my time and my resources into her growth, only to have her decide she wanted to be transplanted into a different garden without my consent. As I walked, I thought about the groom, Marcus. He was a man who prided himself on his intellect, yet he had allowed his fiancée to lie to him about the source of her wealth. I wondered if he truly loved her, or if he just loved the version of her that my money had polished. I finally stopped near the edge of my property, looking out over the valley. The air was turning crisp, a harbinger of the autumn that was coming. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Marcus's father, Richard Whitby. "Anthony, there seems to be a misunderstanding with the venue. Please call me immediately." Richard was a man who never asked for things. He commanded them. He was used to being the most important person in the room, but he was currently standing in a room that I had just unplugged. I smiled, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach my eyes. The misunderstanding was only the beginning. I went back inside and poured myself a second scotch. It was early for a drink, but I figured I had earned it. I sat back down at the computer and opened a new file. This wasn't a contract or a spreadsheet, it was a dossier. Over the years, I had kept records of every cent I had spent on Linda's legal troubles, every letter she had sent me demanding hush money to stay away from Michaela's graduation, and every evidence of her continued addiction. Michaela thought she was bringing a queen to the wedding. I was going to show the Whitbys that she was bringing a liability. The suspense of the next 24 hours was going to be the most critical part of the project. I needed them to stay in the dark just long enough for the momentum to become unstoppable. If they knew the extent of the blackout too early, they might try to scramble for a backup plan, though I knew Richard Whitby would never deign to pay for a wedding he thought was already settled. I wanted them to arrive at the venue on Saturday afternoon, dressed in their finest silks and wools, only to find the gates chained. I wanted the humiliation to be public, permanent, and impossible to explain away. I finally picked up my phone and sent a single text message back to the group chat that included Michaela, Sarah, and Marcus. I didn't address their frantic questions. I didn't express my hurt. I simply wrote, "The project has been terminated due to a breach of contract. Please contact your biological resources for all future inquiries. Enjoy the ceremony." I then powered the phone off and removed the SIM card. For the first time in 10 years, I was truly silent. And for the first time in my life, I understood why some buildings are better left as ruins. The silence in my house was no longer empty. It was heavy, filled with the phantom echoes of a decade of laughter that I now realized was rented, not owned. I spent Friday evening moving through my home with the deliberate slowness of a man who had nowhere left to be. I made a simple dinner of toast and tea, eating in the dining room where Michaela had practiced her wedding vows just 3 weeks ago. She had looked at me then with such performative affection, thanking Dad for making her dreams come true, while all the while she was likely already drafting that 2 a.m. execution order. I realized now that her love was just another line item in the budget, a variable cost she was happy to cut the moment she found a more prestigious supplier. At 7 p.m., the heavy brass knocker on my front door began to rhythmically strike the oak. I didn't need to look through the peephole to know it was Sarah. My wife of 12 years, the woman I had supported through 3 career changes and a midlife crisis, was finally here to face the man she had allowed her daughter to insult. I walked to the door but did not open it. I stood there, feeling the vibrations of her frantic knocking through the wood. She was calling my name, her voice high and strained, a sharp contrast to the composed, elegant woman she pretended to be in front of the Whitbys. She was begging me to be reasonable and stop this childish game, because the venue manager was refusing to let the rehearsal dinner guests inside. I remained perfectly still, my breathing shallow and even. I thought about the many nights I had stayed up late working on spreadsheets to ensure Sarah's boutique business didn't go under. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had poured into her self-discovery retreats while I continued to wear the same 3 suits to work for 5 years. I had been the silent partner in their lives, the invisible infrastructure that allowed them to shine. Now that I had withdrawn my support, they were discovering that they were nothing but shadows in the dark. Sarah began to scream, calling me a bitter old man and a monster for trying to ruin her daughter's life. It was fascinating to see how quickly the mask of love slipped when the flow of capital was restricted. Eventually, the knocking stopped. I heard the gravel crunch under her tires as she sped away, likely heading to the venue to try and charm or bully Elena into opening the doors. She didn't understand that Elena worked for the person who signed the checks, and in the world of high-end events, charm doesn't pay for the security detail or the insurance premiums. I went back to my office and turned on my laptop, but not the phone. I logged into the security system for the wedding venue. As the primary contract holder, I had been given administrative access to the manor's exterior cameras for logistical monitoring. The screen flickered to life, showing the grand wrought iron gates of the estate. The scene was pure chaos. A line of expensive cars was backed up onto the main road, their headlights cutting through the evening mist like searching eyes. I saw Marcus, the groom, standing by the gate, gesturing wildly at the intercom. Beside him, Michaela was a small, shivering figure in a designer coat, her face buried in her hands. And then there was Linda. Even through the graininess of the security feed, I could recognize her. She was dressed in a loud, expensive-looking outfit that screamed new money, clutching a designer handbag that I suspected Michaela had bought for her using the emergency credit card I had provided for wedding incidentals. Linda was arguing with a security guard, her finger wagging in his face, oblivious to the fact that she was currently the face of a catastrophe. I watched as Richard Whitby, the patriarch of the groom's family, stepped out of his black sedan. He moved with a terrifying calmness, the kind of stillness that precedes a corporate takeover. He walked up to Marcus and Michaela, and though I couldn't hear the words, his body language spoke volumes. He pointed at the locked gate, then at Michaela, then at the line of stalled cars. He was a man who didn't tolerate failure, and he certainly didn't tolerate public embarrassment. This was the moment the pedigree Michaela so desperately craved began to sour. The Whitbys weren't seeing a beautiful bride. They were seeing a liability whose family couldn't even manage to unlock a gate. I felt a surge of cold adrenaline. The dossier I had prepared was sitting on my desktop, a PDF titled The Biological Reality. It contained every police report from Linda's past, every receipt for the loans I had paid to keep her from showing up at Michaela's high school graduation in a drunken stupor, and a particularly damning email from Linda to me 3 months ago where she offered to stay away from the wedding entirely if I paid her $50,000. I hadn't replied to that email then, but I was going to use it now. Michaela thought she was choosing her real mother over a stepfather. I was going to show the Whitbys that she was choosing a blackmailer over a benefactor. I spent the rest of the night monitoring the feed. The crowd eventually dispersed as the reality set in. The rehearsal dinner was canceled, and the gates weren't opening. The blackout was holding. I saw Marcus drive away in a separate car from Michaela, a detail that made me lean forward in my chair. The first fracture in the relationship had appeared. When the stress hits a structure, it always breaks at the weakest point. For Marcus and Michaela, the weakest point was the lie they had built their future on. They had told the Whitbys that Michaela was a girl of independent means and noble character. The locked gate was the first piece of evidence that the story was a fiction. As the clock struck midnight, I felt a strange sense of peace. Tomorrow was the wedding day, the day of the coronation that would never happen. I had already arranged for a local moving company to arrive at my house at 8 a.m. I wasn't just burning bridges. I was moving my entire life to a location they would never find. I had sold the house to a corporate developer 6 months ago in a private deal, with the closing date set for the Monday after the wedding. I had planned to surprise Michaela and Sarah with the news and move us all into a luxury penthouse in the city. Now, I was just moving myself. The house would be empty by noon, a hollow shell just like the family I thought I had. Before I went to bed, I performed one final task. I sent the biological reality PDF to Richard Whitby's private office email, which I had obtained during our initial merger discussions. I didn't include a note. I didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. I wanted Richard to have the entire night to digest the truth about his future daughter-in-law. I wanted him to wake up on the wedding morning knowing that the woman walking down the aisle, if there even was an aisle, was the daughter of a woman who had tried to sell her daughter's special day for $50,000. The structural integrity of the marriage was now officially compromised beyond repair. The dawn of the wedding day arrived with a cruel, crisp clarity that felt like a personal endorsement of my plans. At 7 a.m. sharp, the moving truck pulled into my driveway, its hydraulic brakes hissing like a serpent in the quiet neighborhood. I watched from the window as 4 burly men began the process of decommissioning the life I had built in this house, carrying out the heavy mahogany furniture and the boxes of memories I had decided to keep. I had spent the previous night triaging my possessions, discarding anything that reminded me of the decade I had wasted on a family that saw me as a seasonal contractor. Each box taped shut was a seal on a chapter of my life that was now officially over, and as the house grew emptier, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. The movers worked with the efficiency I expected, and I stood in the center of the vacant living room, listening to the hollow echo of my own footsteps. It was a perfect metaphor for the situation. The structure was still standing, but the soul had been evacuated, leaving behind nothing but a shell for the next developer to tear down. My phone, which I had powered back on with a temporary burner SIM, sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking bomb. I hadn't given the number to anyone, but I used the data connection to check the local social media feeds and the wedding guest portal Michaela had so proudly launched months ago. The comment section was a disaster zone of confusion and growing resentment from the out-of-town guests who had arrived at their hotels only to find that their discounted room blocks had been canceled due to non-payment. People were asking if the wedding was still on, complaining about the lack of communication, and tagging Michaela in increasingly frustrated posts. I saw one photo of a bridesmaid sitting on her suitcase in a hotel lobby, looking exhausted and bewildered, while the official wedding hashtag was being flooded with questions about the venue's locked gates. Michaela's social currency was devaluing in real time, and I felt a grim sense of professional satisfaction knowing that her special day was already being categorized as a public failure before the first flower had even been wilted. I decided to drive to the venue one last time, not because I wanted to reconcile, but because a project manager always conducts a final site visit after a demolition to ensure the debris is properly contained. I pulled my silver sedan into a hidden turnout overlooking the manor's main entrance, keeping a safe distance while maintaining a clear line of sight through my binoculars. The scene was even more pathetic than the night before. A white floral archway had been dumped near the gate by a delivery driver who clearly hadn't been informed of the cancellation until he arrived. The expensive silk ribbons were flapping in the wind, catching on the dirt and grease of the road, looking more like crime scene tape than wedding decor. I saw a small group of people gathered by the intercom, and among them was Michaela, still clutching her garment bag containing her $5,000 gown. She looked small and frantic, her hair unstyled and her face pale as she realized the blackout wasn't a temporary glitch, but a permanent state of being. Sarah was there too, pacing back and forth while screaming into her phone, likely trying to reach the caterers or the musicians who had already been paid to stay home. Linda, the real mother, stood off to the side, looking bored and out of place, her eyes scanning the expensive cars of the arriving guests as if she were looking for someone else to grift. It was a tableau of total social bankruptcy. The bride was a fraud, the mother was a failure, and the biological savior was a spectator at her own daughter's destruction. Then, the black sedan of the Whitby family pulled up, and the atmosphere shifted from panicked to icy. Richard Whitby stepped out of the car, looking every bit the high-powered executive he was, holding a printed copy of the biological reality dossier I had emailed him the night before. He didn't look at the gates or the discarded flowers. He walked straight toward Michaela and Sarah with the measured gait of a man who was about to deliver a termination notice. I watched through the lenses as Richard held up the papers, his face a mask of aristocratic disgust that would have withered a lesser woman than Sarah. Michaela began to sob, her shoulders shaking as she reached out to him, but he stepped back as if she were contagious, his lips moving in a sharp, rhythmic cadence that suggested he was reading back the lies she had told his son. He pointed at Linda, who had the audacity to try and introduce herself with a smile, and Richard's response was so visceral that I could see him recoil in real time. He turned his back on them, signaled to his driver, and got back into the car without ever acknowledging the bride who had hoped to join his dynasty. The sedan performed a sharp U-turn, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on Michaela's white garment bag, and just like that, the union of legacies was dissolved before a single vow was spoken. The Whitbys were gone, and they were taking their prestige, their money, and their son with them, leaving the three women alone at the gates of a locked manor. I lowered the binoculars and sat in the silence of my car, watching the dust settle on the road. My phone buzzed with a notification from the venue manager, Elena, informing me that the police had been called to disperse the trespassers who were refusing to leave the gate area. I sent a short reply thanking her for her professionalism and reminding her that my final payment, including the nuisance fee for the staff, had been processed. I put the car in gear and began the drive toward my new life, leaving the ruins of the stepfather behind in the rearview mirror. I had spent 7 years learning how to build things that lasted, but in the end, my most successful project was the one I chose to destroy. As I drove onto the highway, I realized that Michaela was right about one thing. I wasn't her real father. A real father might have let her walk all over him for the sake of a special day. But a senior project manager knows that when a structure is built on a lie, the kindest thing you can do is bring it down before it falls on someone innocent. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of gray asphalt that felt like a clean slate. My move to the city was not just a change of address. It was a strategic relocation designed to ensure that the fallout of the wedding would never reach my front door. I had spent the last few weeks setting up a new life under a private LLC, ensuring that my assets were shielded and my location was obscured. This wasn't about hiding in fear, it was about the finality of the blackout. In my professional life, when a project is cancelled, we don't leave the office open for questions. We lock the doors, archive the files, and move the team to a new assignment. Michaela, Sarah, and Linda were now part of a legacy project that had been officially shuttered, and I had no intention of providing them with a post-mortem analysis of their own failures. As I checked into my temporary luxury apartment, a sleek, glass-walled unit overlooking the harbor, I felt a sense of sterile comfort. There were no photos of Michaela on the walls, no world's best dad mugs in the kitchen, and no lingering scent of Sarah's expensive perfume. I sat on the leather sofa and opened my laptop to see the final ripples of the explosion I had triggered. The local news had picked up the story of the locked manor wedding, featuring footage of the police clearing the gates and interviews with angry guests who were demanding refunds for their travel expenses. The headlines were brutal, questioning the financial stability of the bride's family and hinting at a scandal involving a disgraced biological relative. Michaela's dream of a social coronation had turned into a public execution of her reputation, and the internet, as always, was showing no mercy. I received a notification that Marcus had officially blocked Michaela on all social media platforms and had issued a brief statement through his family's legal counsel. The statement was a masterpiece of corporate coldness, stating that the engagement had been terminated by mutual agreement due to irreconcilable differences in transparency. It was the ultimate F on her report card. She hadn't just lost the wedding, she had lost the man, the family, and the future she had been willing to betray me for. I imagined her sitting in a cheap motel room with Sarah and Linda, looking at the $42,000 worth of nothing she had left, and I wondered if she finally understood the value of the man she had called not a real father. Loyalty isn't something you can buy at a florist, and integrity isn't a confusing aesthetic you can swap out for a better-looking model. Late that evening, I received one final message on my burner phone. It was from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakable. It was Linda. "You think you've won, Anthony?" The text read. "You've ruined a young girl's life because your ego was hurt. You're a pathetic old man playing God with a checkbook. We're going to sue you for every cent of the breach of contract and the emotional distress." I didn't get angry. I actually laughed, a dry, rattling sound that filled the empty apartment. She was still thinking in terms of winning and losing, and she still believed she had a legal leg to stand on. She didn't realize that I had spent 40 years writing the very contracts she was threatening to use against me. I was the one who had included the clauses that protected the payer, the one who had documented her extortion attempts, and the one who had the resources to keep her in court until she was as old as I am. I deleted the message and blocked the number without replying. The emotional distress they were feeling was simply the weight of reality finally crashing down on their heads. They had spent years living in a world supported by my labor, convinced that they were the ones who were talented and special, when they were really just the beneficiaries of a very generous trust. Now that the trust was closed, they were discovering that they had no skills, no savings, and no friends who weren't also there for the free ride. I stood on the balcony, watching the lights of the city twinkle like a vast grid of circuits. I was 70 years old, and for the first time in a decade, I was the only person I had to account for. The project was closed, the site was clear, and the structural integrity of my own life was finally, perfectly restored. I spent my first full week in the city watching the rain streaks on the floor-to-ceiling glass of my new apartment, a silent observer of a world that didn't know I existed. While the movers had finished placing the furniture, the room still felt like a sterile hotel, devoid of the clutter of a life lived for others. I found myself thinking back to 5 years ago, the moment I now realized the first hairline fracture appeared in our foundation. We were at a charity gala for the Municipal Arts Council, an event I had sponsored heavily to help Sarah's boutique gain visibility among the local elite. Michaela, then a college junior, had been introduced to a group of young debutantes, and for the first time, I saw her hesitate when asked about her lineage. She didn't say my name with the usual pride. She gave a vague answer about old family interests and private investments, effectively erasing my face from the conversation while I stood 10 feet away, holding her coat. I should have seen the red flag for what it was, a structural warning that the soil was shifting beneath us. But like a project manager who wants to believe his timeline is still on track, I convinced myself she was just trying to fit in with a crowd that valued ancestors over architects. Over the next few years, the erasure became more systematic and more daring. She began to curate her social media feeds to feature vintage photos of her biological father, Julian, cropped to hide his disheveled state, while my presence was relegated to the background of wide-angle shots. She was building a digital facade, a curated history that suggested a lineage of struggling aristocracy, rather than the reality of a girl raised by a hard-working engineer after her father drank away her college fund. Sarah didn't stop her. In fact, she encouraged it, whispering that perception is the only reality that matters in certain circles. The lies reached a fever pitch when Marcus Whitby entered the picture 18 months ago. Marcus was the scion of a family that could trace its wealth back to the colonial era, a man who viewed life through a lens of pedigree and proper associations. Michaela didn't just fall in love with him. She fell in love with the status his name provided, and she knew that the Whitbys would never accept a stepdaughter of a construction manager as a suitable match. She crafted a narrative where she was the daughter of a prominent, albeit private, European family, and that I was merely the trusted family executor who handled her affairs. It was a humiliating role to play, but at the time, I told myself it was for her happiness. I didn't realize I was voluntarily pouring the concrete for my own burial vault. The dossier I eventually sent to Richard Whitby was the culmination of 2 years of secret data collection. As a project manager, I keep a log of everything, every receipt, every email, every suspicious discrepancy in the scope of work. I had saved the emails where Michaela coached me on what to say to Marcus's parents, instructing me to avoid mentioning my actual job and to instead talk about overseeing global infrastructure portfolios. I had recorded the phone calls where she begged me to pay off Linda's latest gambling debts so that the truth wouldn't come out before the wedding. I was the one who funded the lie, but I was also the one who held the evidence of its fabrication. When I finally hit send on that email to Richard, I wasn't just exposing a fraud, I was correcting the record of my own life. The legal battle began 10 days after the wedding that never was. I was sitting in my new office, a small, efficient space I had rented downtown, when the first process server arrived. The lawsuit was a desperate, sprawling document, filed by a cut-rate law firm Sarah had clearly hired in a panic. They were suing for breach of verbal contract, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and defamation of character. They were seeking $3 million in damages, a figure so absurd it made me chuckle. They claimed that my sudden and malicious cancellation of the wedding had caused Michaela to suffer a mental breakdown and had permanently damaged her social standing. They were trying to use the very social bankruptcy I had created as a weapon against my bank account, forgetting that the law, much like engineering, relies on documented facts rather than hurt feelings. I didn't hire a flashy, celebrity lawyer to handle the countersuit. I hired a man named Arthur Vance, a contract specialist, who looked like he had been carved out of old parchment and who possessed a mind like a legal steel trap. We sat in his wood-paneled office for 6 hours, reviewing the wedding folder. I showed him the primary contract for the venue, which clearly stated that the payer held the sole right to terminate services at any time prior to the commencement of the event. I showed him the signed incidentals agreement, where Michaela had acknowledged that all funds provided were discretionary gifts and not guaranteed entitlements. Arthur smiled, a slow, predatory movement of his lips. "Anthony," he said, "they aren't just bringing a knife to a gunfight, they're bringing a wet noodle to a demolition derby." We filed our response 48 hours later, along with a counterclaim for extortion and fraudulent misrepresentation. We included the email from Linda demanding $50,000 to stay away from the wedding, the hush money that Michaela had begged me to pay. We also included a detailed accounting of every dollar I had spent on Linda's various legal troubles over the last decade, totaling nearly $200,000, which I was now seeking to claw back as loans made under false pretenses. The strategy was simple. I was going to make the cost of suing me so high that they would be forced to liquidate whatever remained of their dignity just to keep the lights on. In construction, if a contractor tries to sue you for a delay they caused, you don't just defend. You hit them with a liquidated damages claim that puts them out of business. The first deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in a neutral conference room at a local court reporting agency. I arrived early, dressed in my best suit, looking every bit the senior project manager who was used to being in charge of the room. Sarah and Michaela arrived late, looking haggard and desperate, their society masks shattered beyond repair. Michaela wouldn't look at me. She kept her eyes fixed on the mahogany table, her hands trembling as she clutched a designer purse that was likely the only valuable thing she had left. Sarah, on the other hand, glared at me with a hatred so pure it was almost impressive. She leaned over the table and whispered, "You think you're so smart, Anthony, but you're just a lonely old man who's going to die in a cold apartment." I didn't respond. I just opened my briefcase and pulled out the first of a dozen folders. The lonely old man was the one with the evidence, and in this room, evidence was the only currency that mattered. The deposition lasted for 8 grueling hours, a slow-motion car crash of revelations that stripped away the last of Michaela's defenses. Arthur Vance began the questioning with the precision of a surgeon, starting not with the wedding, but with the 10 years of financial support I had provided. He presented Michaela with the bank statements from her college years, pointing out the emergency transfers I had made to her account. "Ms. Michaela," Arthur asked, his voice a calm, steady drone, "at the time of these transfers, did you consider Mr. Anthony to be your father?" She hesitated, her eyes darting toward her lawyer, before whispering a quiet, "Yes." Then, Arthur pulled out the transcript of the 2 a.m. text message. "And yet, here you state, and I quote, 'You are not my real father and you are officially uninvited.' Can you explain the structural shift in your perception of his paternity between the time of the bank transfer and the time of this message?" The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the scratching of the court reporter's steno machine. Michaela began to cry, a performative sob that Arthur ignored with the practiced indifference of a man who had seen 1,000 crying brides in his career. He moved on to the Whitby narrative, presenting the email she had sent to Marcus's parents describing her European heritage. He asked her to identify the prominent European relative she had mentioned in her bridal bio. When she couldn't name one, Arthur produced a photo of Linda, taken during her last arrest for public intoxication. "Is this the relative you were referring to?" he asked. The lawyer for the other side tried to object, but Arthur brushed it off, reminding the room that this went directly to the issue of character and transparency, which they had raised in their defamation claim. By mid-afternoon, Sarah was the one on the stand, and she was far more combative than her daughter. She tried to argue that I had manipulated them by being too generous, creating a dependency that gave me undue influence over their lives. It was an interesting legal strategy, blaming the victim for being too helpful. But Arthur was ready. He produced the boutique support agreement I had signed 3 years ago, which showed that I had technically loaned Sarah's business over $300,000 to keep it afloat. "Mrs. Sarah," Arthur said, "if you felt manipulated by Mr. Anthony's generosity, why did you continue to request these manipulative funds as recently as last month?" She didn't have an answer. She just sat there, her face turning a mottled red, the image of the graceful boutique owner finally dissolving into the reality of a social climber whose ladder had just been kicked out from under her. The most satisfying moment came when we addressed Linda's role in the debacle. Linda had refused to show up for the deposition, citing medical issues, but we had a surprise for her. Arthur played a recording of a voicemail Linda had left on my home phone 2 days after the wedding cancellation. In the recording, she was screaming about how she was going to get her share, and that she didn't care about Michaela's wedding as long as she got the payout. The recording was the final nail in the coffin of their emotional distress claim. It proved that the biological mother they had chosen over me was nothing more than a parasite who saw the entire event as a payday. Michaela's face went from pale to ghostly as she listened to her real mother's true voice, realizing that she had traded a decade of stability for a woman who would have sold her for a few $1,000s and a bottle of gin. As we walked out of the conference room that evening, Arthur patted me on the shoulder. "They're going to try to settle," he said. "They know they can't win this in court, and they know that every day this goes on, more of their secrets become public record. Richard Whitby has already contacted me through his own attorneys, looking to join our suit as an intervening party for the fraud Michaela committed against his son." I felt a grim sense of closure. The project wasn't just cancelled, the entire firm was being liquidated. I walked out into the cool evening air of the city, feeling the weight of 70 years settle comfortably onto my shoulders. I wasn't just a stepfather or a silent provider anymore. I was the man who had reclaimed his own history, one document at a time. I spent the next few days in a state of quiet reflection, watching the fallout continue on social media. The Locked Manor wedding had become a cautionary tale, a meme that symbolized the dangers of social climbing and the fragility of lies. Michaela had disappeared from public view, likely hiding in whatever cheap apartment Sarah could still afford. The boutique had closed its doors, a for lease sign appearing in the window where Sarah used to display her overpriced silk scarves. And me. I was busy planning my next project. Not a bridge or a skyscraper, but a foundation for the real people I had neglected while I was busy building a life for a family that didn't exist. I had contacted my biological sister, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, and we were planning a trip to the coast. It turns out that when you stop pouring your energy into a sinkhole, you suddenly have a lot of resources left over for the things that actually matter. The aftermath of the depositions felt like the punch list phase of a massive demolition. The heavy work was done, but there were still dangerous shards of glass and jagged rebar poking out from the rubble. I spent the following weekend in my city apartment, watching the harbor lights and waiting for the final, desperate twitch of a dying animal. I knew Linda wouldn't go quietly. People who live their lives in the shadows of quick fixes and paydays don't understand the finality of a closed contract. On Sunday evening, the security concierge called my unit to inform me that a woman was in the lobby claiming to have legal documents of extreme urgency. I knew immediately it wasn't a process server. It was the biological ghost herself, seeking one last audience with the man who had turned off her faucet. I didn't invite her up. I met her in the neutral, public space of the lobby, under the watchful eyes of the security cameras and the bored gaze of the night staff. Linda looked worse than she had in the grainy security footage from the wedding gates. The designer outfit she had worn was now wrinkled and stained, and her eyes had the frantic, darting quality of someone who was realizing the exits were all locked. She didn't lead with a threat this time. She led with a plea, a shaky performance of motherly concern that I found more offensive than her previous hostility. She told me that Michaela was on the brink, that the girl hadn't eaten in days, and that it was my moral duty as the man who had raised her to provide a bridge until she could get back on her feet. It was a classic gambit, trying to use the very relationship she had helped Michaela renounce as a leverage point for more of my money. I stood there with my hands in my pockets, feeling the cool weight of my keys, and listened to her talk about family and second chances. I let her speak for 10 minutes without interruption, watching her struggle to maintain the facade as my silence began to unnerve her. When she finally ran out of breath, I leaned in slightly, just enough to enter her personal space with the clinical detachment of a building inspector. I told her that I had already seen the bridge she was talking about, and that I had been the one who dismantled it because the structural integrity was zero. I informed her that I had recorded our entire conversation on my phone, just as I had recorded her previous extortion attempts. Her face twisted then, the motherly mask falling away to reveal the predator beneath, and she spat a curse at me that would have made a longshoreman blush. "You think you're so clean, Anthony?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "I know about the off-book payments you made to keep me quiet all those years. I know you used company funds to hide my messes so your precious daughter wouldn't find out who her mother really was. If I go down, I'm taking your professional reputation with me." I didn't blink. I had been waiting for this specific threat for a decade. I calmly pulled a folded sheet of paper from my breast pocket, a certified audit of my personal accounts, signed by a third-party firm. I showed her that every cent I had ever spent on her legal issues had come from my taxed, personal income, and that I had never once touched a dime of my firm's money to clean up her filth. I had kept the two worlds separated with the same rigor I used to separate residential and commercial zoning. The realization that her final nuclear option was a dud seemed to break something inside her. She slumped against the marble pillar of the lobby, her eyes welling with the tears of a failed grifter rather than a grieving mother. I told her that if she ever approached me, my apartment, or my office again, the biological reality dossier wouldn't just be with Richard Whitby. It would be in the hands of the district attorney's office, along with the evidence of her multiple attempts at extortion. I gave her $100 for a cab, the final change order I would ever approve for her, and watched as the security guard escorted her out into the cold rain. As the glass doors clicked shut, I felt a profound sense of relief. The site was finally secure, and the hazardous materials had been removed from the premises. I returned to my unit and sat in the dark, watching the rain wash the city clean. My mind drifted to Michaela, wondering if she truly was on the brink, or if that was just another part of Linda's script. I realized that it didn't matter. In project management, you cannot save a building that has been condemned by the city. Any effort to shore it up is just a waste of resources that could be used for a new, viable structure. Michaela had made her choice at 2 a.m. on a Friday night, and she had to live in the house she had built with those words. I was 70 years old, and the time for reconstruction was over. Tomorrow was the settlement meeting, the final meeting of the project board, and I intended to ensure that the liquidation was total. The final settlement meeting took place in the glass-walled boardroom of Arthur Vance's law firm, a space that felt more like a courtroom than a conference area. Sarah and Michaela were already there when I arrived, seated on one side of the long mahogany table like two defendants awaiting sentencing. Sarah looked 20 years older than she had a month ago, her expensive jewelry gone, replaced by a cheap, sensible suit that suggested she was finally preparing for a life without a benefactor. Michaela was a shadow of her former self, her eyes red-rimmed and her posture defeated, a far cry from the Queen of Sheba she had intended to be. They were accompanied by a harried-looking lawyer who looked like he had already spent his retainer and was just looking for a way to exit the room without being sued for malpractice. Arthur Vance opened the meeting with a stack of documents that was nearly 3 inches thick, the final accounting. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or emotional context. He began reading through the list of our demands, which included the total dismissal of their lawsuit with prejudice, a signed non-disclosure agreement that prohibited them from ever speaking my name to the press, and the immediate repayment of the boutique loans, totaling $300,000. Sarah's lawyer tried to interject, arguing that the loans were gifts made in the context of a marriage, but Arthur was ready. He produced the signed promissory notes I had insisted Sarah sign for every infusion of cash her business had received. "In my client's world," Arthur said, "a gift is a gift, and a loan is a contractual obligation. These documents are signed, notarized, and currently in default." The silence that followed was the sound of a total collapse. Sarah looked at the notes, then at me, her mouth working but no sound coming out. She realized that I wasn't just defending myself against their frivolous suit, I was systematically repossessing their lives. If I called in those loans, Sarah would have to sell her boutique, her car, and likely the few remaining assets she had kept in the divorce. I was giving them a choice. They could walk away with nothing, or they could walk away with a mountain of debt that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. It was the ultimate, leveraged buyout. I was offering to buy their silence and their absence with the debt they had accrued through their own greed. Michaela finally spoke, her voice a thin, cracked whisper that barely carried across the table. "Why are you doing this, Anthony? We were a family. You loved me." I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't see the little girl who needed help with her calculus. I saw the woman who had thought my love was a utility she could turn off when she found a better power source. I told her, in the same voice I used to explain a structural failure to a city council, that family is a contract built on mutual respect and transparency. I told her that she had breached that contract the moment she decided to lie to her fiancé and discard the man who had provided her everything. "I didn't do this to you, Michaela," I said. "You designed this building. I just stopped paying for the materials." The negotiation lasted another 2 hours, but it was really just a formality. They had no cards left to play. By the time the sun began to set, they had signed every document we put in front of them. The lawsuit was dropped. The NDA was signed. And in exchange for my agreement not to pursue the $300,000 in loans, Sarah and Michaela signed a document, waiving all future claims to any part of my estate or interests. They were officially, legally, and socially erased from my life. They walked out of that room without looking back, two people who had tried to play a game of high-stakes social climbing and ended up falling into the very pit they had dug for me. As I stood in the lobby of the law firm after they had gone, Arthur Vance handed me a leather-bound folder. "It's done, Anthony. The project is closed." I thanked him and walked out into the crisp evening air, feeling a strange, hollow sense of victory. I had spent $42,000 to cancel a wedding, and another $50,000 in legal fees to ensure the fallout was permanent, but as I looked at the city lights, I knew it was the best investment I had ever made. I had bought back my dignity, my future, and the right to be more than just a silent provider. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address of a small, quiet Italian restaurant I had discovered near the harbor. I had a reservation for one, and for the first time in 70 years, I was exactly where I wanted to be. The transition from a life of constant maintenance to one of total independence was more jarring than I had anticipated. I spent the first month in my city apartment establishing a new routine, one that didn't involve checking the family calendar or bracing for the next financial emergency from Sarah's boutique. I found myself waking up at 5 a.m., a habit of 40 years, but instead of reviewing site plans, I would sit on my balcony with a cup of black coffee and watch the fog roll off the harbor. The silence was a physical presence, a weight that reminded me of how much noise I had been tolerating for the sake of a facade. I realized that my life had been a series of high-tension wires, and now that the current had been cut, I was finally learning how to stand on solid ground without looking for the next fracture. I decided it was time to reach out to the one person I had pushed aside during my years of duty to Sarah and Michaela, my younger sister, Eleanor. Eleanor had seen through Sarah from the very beginning, calling her a social parasite with a penchant for silk, and as a result, our relationship had withered under the heat of my misplaced loyalty. I drove 3 hours north to the small coastal town where she lived, a place that smelled of salt air and pine needles, far removed from the polished surfaces of the life I had just destroyed. When I pulled into her driveway, I felt a sense of trepidation that I hadn't felt in the boardroom. I was a man who had built bridges across rivers, yet I had let the bridge to my own blood decay for over a decade. Eleanor didn't offer me a lecture or a told-you-so when she opened the door. She simply looked at my face, saw the weariness in my eyes, and pulled me into a hug that felt like a homecoming. We spent the afternoon walking along the rocky shoreline, the wind whipping my hair and the sound of the waves drowning out the echoes of the legal depositions. I told her everything: the text message, the blackout, the dossier, and the final settlement that had erased them from my life. She listened with the quiet intensity of someone who knew the cost of silence, and when I was finished, she stopped and looked out at the horizon. "Anthony," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you didn't just lose a family, you gained your soul back. You were a project manager for people who were never going to finish the job." While I was finding peace on the coast, the social bankruptcy of Michaela and Sarah was continuing its inevitable downward spiral. Eleanor showed me a local news clipping from the town we had left, a small column in the police blotter section that mentioned a disturbance at a low-end apartment complex. It seemed that Sarah and Michaela had been involved in a public dispute with a landlord over unpaid rent, a scene that had ended with their remaining belongings being piled on the sidewalk. The pedigree was gone, replaced by the harsh reality of a life without a safety net, and the community that once fawned over them was now whispering about their fall from grace. They were discovering that in a small town, a disgraced reputation is a life sentence with no possibility of parole. I felt a twinge of something that wasn't quite pity. It was more like the clinical observation of a structural collapse. I thought about the many times I had warned them about the importance of reserve funds and emergency planning, only to be laughed off as a pessimistic old man. They had built their lives on the assumption that the stepfather bank would never close its doors, and now they were learning that a bank is only as good as the trust of its investors. I spent the rest of the week with Eleanor, helping her repair a weathered deck and painting the trim on her cottage. These were small, honest tasks that required no contracts or legal maneuvers, and as I worked, I felt the last of the wedding poison leaving my system. I was 7 years old, and I was finally learning that the most important structures aren't the ones you build for the world to see, but the ones you build for the people who actually love you. To truly understand the blackout, I had to conduct a forensic audit of the moments leading up to the engagement, the time I now call the architect of deceit phase. I spent an evening in my apartment reviewing old journals and digital photos, looking for the exact moment the plan to uninvite me was hatched. I stopped at a photo from the engagement party, a lavish affair I had funded at a private country club 6 months before the wedding. In the photo, Michaela is standing between Marcus and his father, Richard Whitby, her face glowing with a triumphant light that I had mistaken for happiness. Behind her, partially obscured by a floral arrangement, Sarah is whispering into Linda's ear, the biological mother who had accidentally shown up at the club that night. I remember that night vividly now, the way Sarah had insisted that Linda was just there to find closure, and that I should be the bigger man and allow her to stay for a drink. I hadn't realized then that I was witnessing the first meeting of the conspirators, the moment they realized that if they could play their cards right, they could have the Whitby prestige and my money simultaneously. I saw the way Michaela looked at me that night, not as a father, but as a hurdle that needed to be cleared before she could cross the finish line into the aristocracy. They had been planning the real parents' narrative for months, coaching Linda on how to act, what to say, and how to present herself as a tragic figure of circumstance rather than a career grifter. The level of coordination was staggering. Sarah had even gone so far as to scrub our home of any photos that showed me in a prominent parental role before Marcus's parents came over for dinner. I recalled coming home one evening to find the hallway gallery rearranged, my face replaced by generic heritage landscapes and photos of Michaela as a child with a carefully cropped-out background. When I asked about it, Sarah had laughed and said she was just freshening up the decor for the guests. I had been so busy managing the external world that I hadn't noticed the internal demolition and remodel that was happening right under my nose. I was the one paying for the paint, and they were using it to paint me out of the picture. I also discovered a series of deleted emails on our shared home computer that I had managed to recover during the blackout preparation. These were messages between Michaela and a luxury branding consultant she had hired using my credit card, a woman who specialized in origin story curation for social climbers. The consultant had advised Michaela on how to transition the stepfather into an executor role, suggesting that it would make her seem more like an heiress and less like a girl with a middle-class upbringing. The narrative of the faithful family servant is very chic in these circles, the consultant had written, a phrase that made my blood run cold even months later. My love, my sacrifice, and my 10 years of labor had been rebranded as service to a girl who didn't even know how to balance a checkbook. This realization changed the way I viewed the 2 a.m. text message. It wasn't a sudden, impulsive decision fueled by pre-wedding nerves. It was the final step in a long-term strategic plan. They had waited until the final payment for the venue was processed and the force majeure window for the vendors had narrowed, thinking they had me trapped by my own financial commitments. They thought my pride wouldn't allow me to cancel an event that would result in a $42,000 loss, but they forgot that a project manager knows when to cut bait. To them, $42,000 was a fortune. To me, it was a small price to pay to avoid a lifetime of being a chic family servant to a pack of liars. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, feeling a grim sense of pride in my own ruthlessness. I had been the one who taught Michaela how to think ahead, and she had tried to use that lesson against me. She just hadn't realized that the teacher always keeps a few secrets for himself. 3 months after the blackout, the dust had finally settled on the construction site of my former life, and the city air felt cleaner than it ever had in the suburbs. I was sitting in a high-end bistro near the financial district, enjoying a solo lunch of grilled sea bass and a crisp Chardonnay, when I saw a figure through the glass that made me pause mid-sip. It was Marcus Whitby. He looked different. The sharp, arrogant edge of his posture had been replaced by a subtle slump of the shoulders, and the expensive tailored suit he wore seemed to hang a bit loosely on his frame. He was walking toward the entrance. His eyes scanned the room with a weary caution that I recognized as the look of someone who had recently survived a high-speed collision with the truth. I didn't try to hide. I simply watched him as he entered the restaurant and spotted me. For a moment, he froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his briefcase, and I could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. He eventually began to walk toward my table, his gait hesitant, and I signaled for the waiter to bring another chair. He sat down without an invitation, the silence between us heavy with the weight of $42,000 and 1,000 lies. "I wasn't sure if I should ever talk to you again, Anthony," he said, his voice lacking the projected authority I had heard during the engagement. "My father told me you were the one who sent the email, the one who pulled the plug on everything." I set my glass down and looked him in the eye, maintaining the steady, clinical gaze of a man who had nothing left to hide. I told him that I hadn't just pulled a plug. I had performed a necessary emergency shutdown of a project that was built on a foundation of structural fraud. I explained that while I regretted the public humiliation his family had suffered, it was far better to be embarrassed at a locked gate than to be legally bound to a woman who viewed his lineage as a trophy and my love as a utility. Marcus looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the grain of the wood as if he were looking for a flaw. "She told me you were just a distant relative who handled her trust," he whispered. "She made me believe that she was coming into the marriage with her own legacy, and that you were just a formality." I felt a surge of cold validation as he spoke, hearing the echoes of the chic family servant narrative that the branding consultant had cooked up. I told Marcus the truth, the real truth, about the 10 years of private schools, the paid-off bail bonds for Linda, and the loans to keep Sarah's boutique from sinking into the abyss. I told him about the 2 a.m. text message that had served as the final stress test for the relationship. He listened in stunned silence, his face paling as the full scale of the manipulation became clear. He realized then that he hadn't just been marrying a girl. He had been the target of a three-way heist orchestrated by a mother, a daughter, and a biological ghost who saw him as the ultimate payday. "My father nearly disinherited me," Marcus confessed, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and relief. He saw the biological reality documents and realized that we were about to link the Whitby name to a woman with a criminal record and a history of extortion. We spent the last 12 weeks scrubbing her name from our social circles, but the stain is hard to remove. I told him that stains are like rust on a bridge. If you don't catch them early, they eat through the core until the whole structure collapses. I told him he should thank whatever God he believed in that I was a man of contracts and not a man of sentiment. If I had been a better man, he would currently be sharing a bed with a fraud and a bank account with a parasite. As he got up to leave, he paused and looked at me with a strange expression that might have been respect. "You really burned it all down, didn't you, Anthony? You didn't leave a single brick standing." I leaned back in my chair and smiled, a thin, professional expression. I told him that in my line of work, we don't do partial demolitions. If a building is unsafe, you bring it down to the foundation and clear the site for something better. He nodded, turned, and walked out of the bistro, a man who had been humbled but also liberated. I watched him go, feeling the final change order of the wedding project being filed away. The Whitbys were safe, Marcus was wiser, and the liars were alone in the dark. I finished my lunch in a state of quiet satisfaction, realizing that my encounter with Marcus was the final inspection I needed. I had seen the results of my work in the eyes of a survivor, and it confirmed that my blackout had been an act of mercy as much as it was an act of revenge. I spent the rest of the afternoon walking through the city, feeling the rhythm of the streets and the energy of a world that was constantly building and rebuilding itself. I was 70 years old, and I was finally understanding the true nature of infrastructure. It's not about the steel or the concrete. It's about the integrity of the people who walk across the bridge. If the people are hollow, the bridge is just a trap. The final chapter of my 70-year journey didn't end with a bang or a scream, but with the quiet, rhythmic ticking of a clock in a room filled with books. I had moved my most precious items, the ones that didn't remind me of Sarah or Michaela, into a small library in my city apartment. Among them was my grandfather's old drafting set, a collection of silver compasses and rulers that had been used to design the first bridges in our county. I found myself sitting at my desk, running my fingers over the cold metal, thinking about the concept of load-bearing capacity. We all have a limit to what we can carry, and for a decade, I had been carrying the weight of a family that was actively trying to hollow me out from the inside. I received a final report from the private investigator I had hired to keep a distant eye on the hazardous waste I had removed from my life. It was a short, clinical document that told me everything I needed to know to close the file forever. Sarah had declared personal bankruptcy and was now working as a floor manager at a mid-range department store in a neighboring state, her boutique dreams a distant, bitter memory. Michaela had disappeared into the anonymity of the service industry, working double shifts at a diner to pay off the mounting legal fees from her failed lawsuit. And Linda? Linda had returned to her natural habitat, a series of short-term motels and petty scams, her brief dream of Whitby wealth having evaporated like mist in the morning sun. They were living the lives they had earned, lives devoid of the aesthetic and the pedigree they had been willing to kill for. I felt no joy in their suffering, but I felt a profound sense of justice in their reality. They were finally seeing the world without the filter of my money, and they were discovering that they were remarkably unremarkable people. I realized that my $42,000 revenge wasn't just about the money. It was about removing the artificial support beams that had allowed them to pretend they were something they weren't. Without me, they weren't queens or heiresses. They were just three women who had forgotten how to tell the truth. It was a structural failure of the character, and as any engineer will tell you, those are the hardest to repair. I spent my 70th birthday on the coast with Eleanor, watching the sun set over the Atlantic. We didn't talk about the wedding or the lawsuit or the blackout. We talked about the future, about the trip to Italy we were planning and the scholarship fund I was setting up for young engineers from underprivileged backgrounds. I wanted to build something that would outlast me, something that wasn't dependent on the whims of social climbers or the greed of parasites. I wanted to invest in people who understood the value of a foundation and the importance of a binding signature. I was done building bridges for people who just wanted to use them to escape their own pasts. As the stars began to appear in the sky, reflecting off the dark water, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't felt in my entire professional life. I had managed thousands of projects, overseen millions of dollars in contracts, and built structures that would stand for centuries, but my most important work had been the demolition of the lie I was living. I had reclaimed my name, my resources, and my peace of mind. I was Anthony, a senior project manager who knew exactly how to burn a bridge when the structural integrity was compromised beyond repair. And as I looked at the horizon, I knew that the fire I had started that Friday night at 2 a.m. had finally burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but fertile ground. I am a man of contracts, and the contract I have with myself for the remainder of my years is simple. No more silent provision, no more unrequited loyalty, and no more building for those who do not value the builder. I have spent 70 years learning that the most expensive things in life are the ones you get for free, and the most valuable things are the ones you have the courage to protect. My name is Anthony, and this is the story of how I turned a bride's betrayal into her own social bankruptcy. If you find yourself being the step for someone who won't even give you a seat at the table, remember my story. Don't beg for a place, build your own table, and make sure the locks are changed before the sun goes down. The project is officially closed. The site is clear. The final inspection is passed. I stood up from the porch swing, stretched my 70-year-old bones, and walked into the house with my sister. The lights were on, the fire was warm, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for a text message to tell me who I was. I already knew. I was the man who held the keys, and I was the one who decided when the show was over. The silence of the night was no longer a threat. It was a promise. A promise that the only thing waiting for me tomorrow was a day I had designed entirely for myself. And in the end, that is the only legacy that truly matters. I spent the following week at my sister's coastal home, but my mind remained a restless construction site, constantly reviewing the as-built drawings of my past decade. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself performing a forensic audit of the small, seemingly insignificant moments where the rot had first begun to set in. I remembered a specific Christmas 3 years ago when I had gifted Michaela a vintage watch that had belonged to my own mother, a piece of history I had cherished for 50 years. She had thanked me with a practiced smile, but I noticed later that evening she had left it on the kitchen counter, opting instead to wear a flashy modern piece that Marcus's family had given her as a welcome gift. At the time, I told myself she was just excited about her new social circle, but now I see it as a clear signal of the decommissioning of my heritage. The psychological toll of being a silent provider is that you eventually become invisible to the very people you are shielding from the world's harshness. I had spent 10 years absorbing every financial shock and every emotional tremor so that Sarah and Michaela could live in a bubble of perfect stability. I was the insulation in the walls and the reinforced steel in the foundation, the kind of infrastructure that no one notices until it's gone. I realized that by being too reliable, I had accidentally trained them to treat me like a natural resource rather than a human being with feelings and limits. They didn't think I could ever stop providing because, in their minds, I wasn't a man. I was a utility, as constant and unthinking as the gravity that held their house together. I sat on Eleanor's porch and opened a notebook, beginning to draft what I called the maintenance log of a failed marriage. I listed the dates of Sarah's business emergencies, and the exact amounts I had wired to keep her vanity boutique from falling into receivership. I wrote down the names of the lawyers I had paid to keep Linda's name out of the local papers when she was caught shoplifting or causing disturbances in nearby towns. Looking at the numbers in black and white was a sobering experience, a cold reminder of the millions of dollars in emotional capital I had invested in a project that had a negative return. I wasn't just a victim of a sudden betrayal. I was a man who had ignored 1,000 structural warnings because I wanted to believe the building was safe. The silence of the coast allowed me to process the anger that I had kept tightly bottled during the blackout phase. In project management, anger is a useless emotion. It doesn't fix a budget and it doesn't move a deadline, but in the quiet of my retirement, it finally demanded its seat at the table. I wasn't angry that they wanted Linda at the wedding. I was angry that they thought they could use my money to pay for the very hands that would push me out the door. It was the audacity of the transaction that fueled my fire, the belief that my love was something that could be bought, paid for, and then discarded once the warranty had expired. I spent hours walking the beach, letting the cold Atlantic air sharpen my resolve, ensuring that the reconstruction of Anthony would be built on a much more resilient foundation. While I was finding my peace in the salt air, the digital world was busy tearing the carcass of the Locked Manor wedding apart. The story had moved beyond local gossip and had entered the realm of the viral cautionary tale, with thousands of strangers weighing in on the morality of my actions. I spent an evening in the local library, using their computer to browse the forums and social media threads where my life was being dissected by people who had never met me. It was fascinating to see how the narrative had shifted. Some called me a hero for the silent providers, while others painted me as a vengeful patriarch who had used his wealth as a weapon. I didn't care about the labels, but I was intensely interested in the secondary shockwaves that were hitting Sarah and Michaela's remaining social connections. Every bridge they had tried to build into the Whitby world was now officially on fire, with Marcus's family reportedly filing their own civil suits to recover the costs of the engagement gifts and travel. The internet had done what I couldn't. It had made the social bankruptcy of the three women a permanent, searchable record that would follow them for the rest of their lives. I saw photos posted by friends of the bride who were now mocking her for the fake European heritage she had claimed, sharing screenshots of her desperate attempts to keep the lie alive. The pedigree she had sacrificed me for was now a punchline, a digital scarlet letter that ensured she would never again be welcomed into the rooms where reputation is the only currency. I felt a grim sense of professional satisfaction, knowing that my blackout had achieved total coverage. I received a notification from my bank that Sarah had made a final, desperate attempt to access our old joint line of credit, an account I had closed 48 hours after the 2 a.m. text. The system had flagged the attempt and sent me an automated report of the unauthorized access request. I looked at the timestamp and realized she was trying to pull funds while she was likely standing in the office of her own bankruptcy attorney. It was a pathetic, predictable move from a woman who had never learned how to create value, only how to extract it from others. I didn't call her, and I didn't alert the authorities. The system had done its job, and the door remained locked. The utility was officially disconnected, and she was finally being forced to sit in the dark and account for her own choices. The most surprising development was an email I received from a former colleague, a man who had worked under me on the bridge projects in the city. He told me that my story had become a legend in the engineering firms, a rallying cry for the men and women who felt they were being taken for granted by the people they supported. He thanked me for showing them that the builder has the ultimate power, and that we don't have to keep pouring our lives into structures that don't respect the blueprint. It was the first time I realized that my revenge wasn't just personal. It was a statement of professional dignity. I wasn't just a stepfather who got even. I was a senior project manager who had successfully executed the most difficult decommissioning of his career. The final breach occurred on a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the mist was so thick on the coast that you couldn't see the ocean from the porch. I heard a car pull into Eleanor's gravel driveway, the engine sounding strained and old, a sharp contrast to the luxury vehicles I was used to hearing. I walked to the window and saw Sarah's car, the one I had bought her for her 50th birthday, looking battered and unwashed. She stepped out of the vehicle, and even from a distance, I could see that the boutique owner was gone. She was wearing a cheap tracksuit, her hair was a mess, and she moved with the frantic, jerky motions of someone who had nothing left to lose. She didn't knock. She began to scream my name from the driveway, her voice echoing off the trees like a wounded animal. I walked out onto the porch, flanked by the heavy wooden pillars of Eleanor's home, and looked down at her. I didn't say a word. I simply stood there with my arms crossed, a human wall that she could no longer scale. She began a long, rambling monologue about fairness and the years we spent together, accusing me of being a monster who had enjoyed her destruction. She claimed that Michaela was broken and that I had murdered her future because of a silly text message. I listened until she ran out of breath, her face red and her eyes streaming with tears that I knew were shed for herself, not for the daughter she had helped corrupt. When she finally fell silent, the only sound was the distant crashing of the waves against the rocks. "Sarah," I said, my voice low and steady, "you didn't lose your future because of a text message. You lost it because you built your entire life on a foundation of sand and then expected me to keep the tide back forever." I told her that I had spent 12 years being the silent partner in her lies, and that I was finally done with the investment. I reminded her that she had been the one who encouraged Michaela to lie to the Whitbys, and she had been the one who invited Linda back into our lives as a weapon against my authority. I told her to look at the car she was driving and the clothes she was wearing and realize that those were the only things she truly owned. The rest had been a gift that she had seen fit to insult. She tried one last gambit, dropping to her knees on the gravel and begging for one last loan to get Michaela into a new apartment. She promised she would never bother me again if I just gave her $10,000 to reset their lives. I looked at her and felt a profound sense of emptiness. There was no anger left, only the cold clarity of a finished project. I told her that the bank was closed, the account was settled, and the reset had already happened the moment the manor gates were locked. I turned my back on her and walked into the house, locking the door behind me with a solid metallic click. I heard her scream one last time, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, before I heard her car door slam and the gravel crunch as she sped away. The final breach had been attempted, and the structure had held. The final close-out report of my life began on the first day of spring. I had officially moved out of the city and into a small, beautifully engineered home I had built for myself on a piece of land adjacent to Eleanor's. It wasn't a manor, and it didn't have a grand gate, but every beam was straight, every joint was tight, and every signature on the deed was mine alone. I spent my mornings working on the scholarship fund, which I had named the Integrity in Infrastructure Initiative. I had already selected the first 3 recipients, young students who had overcome incredible odds to study engineering, and I felt a sense of purpose that the wedding fairy tale could never have provided. I was finally building something that wasn't designed to be a social coronation, but a genuine legacy of hard work and honesty. I received a final letter from Arthur Vance, my attorney, informing me that all legal proceedings had been officially concluded. The biological reality dossier was now a permanent part of the public record in the court archives, and Sarah and Michaela had been barred from filing any further claims against me in any jurisdiction. Linda had been arrested again, this time for a low-level fraud involving a charity for veterans, and was facing a significant prison sentence. The 3-way heist had ended in a total collapse for all involved, leaving them as nothing more than footnotes in a story about the dangers of greed. I placed the letter in my finalized projects folder, closed the drawer, and felt the weight of the last 10 years lift from my shoulders for the very last time. I often think about the opening paragraph of this new chapter. My name is Anthony, and I am 70 years old. I am a man who spent his life building things for people who didn't appreciate the effort, until I finally realized that the most important project was my own freedom. I don't just build bridges. I know exactly how to dismantle the ones that lead to toxic places. I am no longer the silent provider or the stepfather executor. I am the architect of my own peace, A man who knows that the most beautiful structure in the world is a life lived with integrity and a conscience that is as clear as a blueprint on a fresh sheet of paper. The $42,000 I spent on that canceled wedding was the best investment of my life, because it bought me the one thing money usually can't buy: the truth. As I sit on my porch tonight, watching the lighthouse on the point blink its rhythmic warning to the ships at sea, I feel a sense of profound contentment. The project is closed, the sight is clear, and the structural integrity of my soul is finally, perfectly restored. I have reached the end of the road I was forced onto, and I have paved a new one that leads exactly where I want to go. The silence is no longer a void. It is a solid, reliable foundation upon which I can build anything I choose. My name is Anthony, and for the first time in 70 years, I am exactly who I was meant to be. The social bankruptcy of the liars is complete, and the wealth of a life well lived is finally, entirely mine. If you loved my story, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you have watched it from and what you would have done if you were in my place. This inspires us to share more such stories with you.